The following is a presentation of Hobson Media. Woohoo!
If you're a fan of the positive, inspiring interviews we share each week on The Big Impact, this news will be of great interest because we've overhauled, renovated, remodeled the rewards you'll receive when you support The Big Impact on Patreon. Whether it's $5, $10, $20, or $50 per month, we've got a special something for everyone who joins our team as we continue bringing positive conversations to a culture in need of uplifting content. So, go to patreon.com and search for The Big Impact. Check out the new rewards and do what you can to help the show.
All these men were great heroes to go over there, leave their homes. Many of them jumped to enlist in the spring of 1917. And I just find the whole era, the American wonderment, the American spirit, the spunk, that's what I love.
They've been expecting it for months, and so the men of Company A of the 339th Infantry Regiment, the Polar Bears, they would come to call themselves, have stood night and day in 40 below temperatures. They stamp their feet and try not to touch bare skin on the barrels of their weapons lest it be ripped off. They peer through the deep ebony night from their dark, log-lined dugouts into the frigid tundra toward the south and east across the ice-choked river and watch for it, wait for it, and wonder how many will come and how they will perform when they do. And they wonder, too, if and how they will ever get out of this place, this frozen Hades, this last place on earth at the top of the world. And then early on this morning, they do come, a horde of them, dim forms in the distance, spread out across the Vaga River, some on skis, others on snowshoes, and all of them armed like ghost warriors traversing the river Styx. Hundreds of them, to their mere handful of 46. Here come the Bolsheviks. Here stand the Polar Bears. Today on The Big Impact, we celebrate the heroes of World War I, a group of men known as the Polar Bears.
This is The Big Impact, featuring conversations with inspiring, motivational, creative, innovative, and just plain interesting people from all walks of life. Here's Bill Hobson.
In the year 2019, I think we throw around the concept and the word heroes far too often. In fact, I was watching a golf tournament over the weekend where in Los Angeles the temperatures had dropped to a dangerous upper 40s. And the announcers were describing the brave effort being put forth by the competitors at Riviera Country Club. For our featured guest today, that concept is probably rather humorous, given the investigation he has done into some actual heroes from about 100 years ago. And let us welcome in James Carl Nelson, the author of The Polar Bear Expedition, because, James, these guys really do personify what heroes are meant to be, right?
Oh, totally. Yeah, that's why we subtitled the book "The Heroes of America's Forgotten Invasion of Russia." Just their incredible endurance in the face of horrible odds and horrible conditions makes them heroes.
Well, we hear the word Russia a lot in the news these days, but the term or the phrase "invasion of" isn't usually part of it, and so. In American history, we have to go back before what most people think of as the only big war we've ever had, which was World War II, to the original Great War, the World War I, or however you want to refer to it. Can you help set the scene for what was taking place before we get into the actual group of men known as the Polar Bears?
Sure. As most people know, World War I began in 1914. And Russia was a part of that, was an ally of Britain and France and later America. And whereas the British and French and later the Americans were fighting on the Western Front in France, Russia was holding down the Eastern Front in Eastern Prussia, through Poland, areas like that. A very long front as well. They were fighting the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. So in 1917, late that year, the Russian Revolution occurred, and the leader of the Bolsheviks, Vladimir Lenin, I have to be careful not to say Putin. I'm sometimes, and he took Russia out of the war. So that freed the Germans to transfer 80 divisions to the Western Front. On March 21st, 1918, the Germans launched a huge offensive that aimed to drive the British and the French into the Atlantic Ocean. They very nearly succeeded. By early June, they were 30 miles from Paris, but were stopped by the Marines and regulars of the 2nd Division at Belleau Wood, a very famous story most people have heard of. But the situation was perilous, nevertheless, and the Allied command began casting about for some way to take the pressure off of the Western Front with all these new German troops pressing on them. And they came up with the idea of recreating the Eastern Front by any means they could. And they solved the problem, or came up with the solution that they thought would work, would be reconstituting the Eastern Front through an intervention. They would land troops, and naturally the peasants would join them. They didn't like the Bolsheviks. The Allies were convinced. And they would also hook up with this, it was called the Czech Legion. It was 40,000 to 80,000 former prisoners of war of the Russians, who the Bolsheviks allowed to pass to the west. They wanted to get to Vladivostok and then to the Western Front. They thought if they could turn these men around, get the peasants to revolt, and then they would simply march on Vologda and St. Petersburg and Moscow and undo the Russian Revolution. In the meantime, they were pressing President Woodrow Wilson to join the party, and he was very hesitant to do so. He wanted to keep all of his resources on the Western Front. But finally, in mid-July 1918, he agreed to send one regiment into northern Russia and two to Vladivostok, but that's another story. Send one regiment into northern Russia with the express purpose of guarding stores, these millions of dollars worth of material, war materials and other, that the Allies had been supplying the Russian army with through the years. And that is why the 339th U.S. Regiment found itself not headed to France, but headed to Archangel, Russia in late August of 1918.
Well, they were headed to some rather harsh conditions, to say the very least. You know, I joke about what we heard on the golf tournament over the weekend, describing it as, a difficult situation in which to compete. This was truly the coldest possible scenario. I mean, you thought polar vortex would have been spring break for these guys. It was just absolutely inhumanly cold. And if I understand right from your book, The Polar Bear Expedition, they weren't just jogging through it. They were sitting in it for days and weeks at a time.
Yeah, we had the vortex here in Minneapolis 3 weeks ago when we got down to air temperature of 29 below zero. And believe me, I was thinking about those guys a lot, but they were under much worse conditions. I mean, they were fighting and holding the line in temperatures of 50, 60, 70 below through the winter of 1918, 1919. And in fact, they crossed the Arctic Circle on their transports on the way to Archangel. And as a harbinger of perhaps the fates of the expedition, they had packed all of their winter clothing in the holds of the ships, so none of the men could access them. So they're freezing already. Meanwhile, the flu breaks out on the transports, which had served in South Pacific and were ridden with flu bug. Men were sick. Some were dying. They were already dying, and they were throwing their bodies overboard. And after they arrived in Archangel on September 5th, 1918, in the ensuing just couple of weeks, about 70 men of the 339th Regiment died.
Wow. There's a lot to dig into as we think about these men. I'm in Michigan, you're in Minnesota, and a good proportion of these polar bears were from frozen parts of America, a lot of them from Michigan, from the Detroit area. How did you come to learn more and investigate something that happened this long ago? I would have to think that record keeping was a bit sketchy.
Actually, no. Once I delved into this story, which had for a while, I'd kind of been at the back of my brain. This is my fourth book about the World War I era. There's this great repository in Ann Arbor called the Bentley Historical Library. They have a whole section devoted to the story of the polar bears, and they've been collecting letters, memoirs, diaries, photos, all sorts of great material for a researcher and author to take his pick from. And in fact, I've written 2 books about the 1st Division of World War I and one about the 2nd Division. This regiment, the 339th, is the best self-documented unit that I've ever come across. On the Western Front, the men were not supposed to keep diaries in case they would fall in the hands of the enemy and reveal, I don't know, what kind of certain military secrets or whatever they might. But this regiment, I think, the men really understood that this was unusual. This was something different that nobody else was going through, and so they kept diaries. And when the survivors did return, they created the Polar Bear Association, and they were really devoted to telling the story of what they'd gone through in the wastes of northern Russia in 1918 and 1919.
The differences between equipment, combat mindsets, war strategies, and all those things over the course of a century is really pretty mind-boggling. Obviously, there's not any technology. They aren't using GPS-guided compasses to make their way through these territories, and there's no Gore-Tex. They're not exactly prepared for minus 50 degrees temperatures. Can you speak to a little bit of the tangible physical differences between then and now to help our audience get a really good feel for how tough these conditions really were?
Well, back then they were issued winter clothing. They had wool. They had fur overcoats, fur hats, fur mittens. They did their best to try to supply these guys. I think there was a good understanding that it was going to get cold. And like you say, most of these men were from Michigan, so they knew cold, but they certainly didn't know cold like northern Russia cold. But that's one of the reasons that they selected the regiment in the first place. So I think for the standard of the day, at least clothing-wise, they did the best they could. As far as, their weapons, they were told to turn in their Springfield rifles, and instead were issued American-made, Russian-designed Mosin Nagant rifles, which they said the aim was so poor it could shoot around corners. But they wanted to issue these rifles to them because there were millions of bullets on hand at Archangel to fire. They had just a couple of batteries of Canadian artillery came over later in the fall, so they didn't really have any artillery, whereas the Bolsheviks were gathering artillery through the winter and were getting pretty good at laying down bombardments. So also just sheer numbers. There were 5,000 men in the regiment, maybe another 5,000 Allied soldiers, Poles, Brits, French who had gone over. So at any given point, there's, say, 11,000 Allied soldiers facing 45,000 Bolshevik soldiers and increasing that number through the winter.
If you're a fan of the positive, inspiring interviews we share each week on The Big Impact, this news will be of great interest because we've overhauled, renovated, remodeled the reward you'll receive when you support The Big Impact on Patreon. Whether it's $5, $10, $20, or $50 per month, we've got a special something for everyone who joins our team as we continue bringing positive conversations to a culture in need of uplifting content. So, go to patreon.com and search for The Big Impact. Check out the new rewards and do what you can to help the show. We've launched a 24/7 Big Impact listener hotline because we want to hear your thoughts, comments, questions, and guest suggestions. You can call 989-787-1093 anytime, day or night, and let us know what's on your mind. The Big Impact exists because we want to encourage you with positive and inspiring interviews, so let us know how we're doing. Call the Big Impact Listener Hotline at 989-787-1093. Welcome back into the Big Impact, where we are talking today with James Carl Nelson, the author of The Polar Bear Expedition, an incredible group of soldiers and heroes from World War I. And James, I sit here in amazement as I've read through the book and I think about these heroes from this long ago, and I'm kind of perplexed as to where and how we have today come to describe heroic efforts. We've ascribed those things to athletic achievement. We've ascribed them to someone standing up to a bully or whatever it is. But But man, when you get down to it, you're given an assignment to put your life on the line in this remote part of the world. I would have to think, James, that it's at times bewildering to the men involved as to what in the world are we doing here. I can't even see civilization from where we're stationed, and yet I'm following orders. I'm miserable. I haven't felt my feet in a week, and 80% of our guys aren't coming home again. How did these men maintain their sense of duty and realize the bigger purpose of the mission during such misery?
Yeah, right off the bat, the actual purpose of the mission changed. The British were running the show, and whereas Wilson had wanted them to simply guard stores, not get involved in the internal politics of Russia, just sit tight around Archangel. As soon as they landed, the British hustled the 339th, 1st and 3rd battalions far into the interior. The 1st Battalion was sent up the Dvina River, hundreds of miles. The 3rd Battalion was sent down the railway line towards Obozerskaya with the intention of taking Vologda, which is another 400 miles away. One of the main things is that the combat was instant. They encountered what they called the bolos, and that's what the men called them. And the constant theme becomes really, why are we still here? The armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, that ended the war on the Western Front. And word got back to these guys, and they were dispersed across a 400-mile front, single companies holding vast amounts of area. And that became an overriding question. Why are we still here when the war's over? And yet they still had to put their mind to it and put their effort into it and fight against overwhelming odds, all the while not having a clue what they're fighting for, because they can never get a good answer from anybody. In January 19th, 1919, a single platoon of Company A was holding the farthest flung line at a place called Nizhny Gora on the Volga River. And at dawn, these 46 men were attacked by 1,700 Bolsheviks and began a month-long running fight for life. 25 of the men were killed in action. Many of them disappeared until their bodies were recovered some years later. And then, ironically, on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1918, Company B on the Dvina River was attacked similarly, was able to hold these hordes of Bolsheviks off. They had been able to fortify their position better. They had some Canadian artillery with them, but it was a battle for 3 or 4 days. They wound up burning half of a village down to get rid of the threat of snipers. And meanwhile, it's already 20 below. The snow's falling, and that the war supposedly is over, and yet that's when the war in Russia really began.
We think about terms like Bolsheviks, and we don't know anything about it. It's been a long time since in high school history classes, U.S. history classes, that World War I or the Great War has been taught. So fill us in on this fun-loving group of nice guys known as Bolsheviks.
A lot of them actually were sailors. The sailors had been radicalized early on and were a big part of the Bolshevik revolution, striking in the ports and this. And they readily joined the Red Army. The Red Army was basically zero at the revolution. The Tsarist army had been disbanded. And Leon Trotsky was in charge. He was the Minister of War, and he was building up a Red Army by any means he could. So he had sailors, you had other volunteers, you had conscripts from the villages. They would just say it was not even a draft; they just grabbed men out of the villages to fight. So it was initially it was a ragtag army, I would say, even when they had several tens of thousands of men. But through the winter of 1918, 1919, Trotsky whipped this force into shape. And by the summer of 1919, the Red Army consisted of 600,000 men. They weren't all fighting the Allies in northern Russia or Vladivostok. They were very concerned with the civil war that was going on. They were fighting the whites, the Tsarist loyalists. And those battles were taking place all over Russia. But Trotsky had a special train, armored train, that he would go from front to front. And he visited the front in the Archangel area, and it was present at one battle in the fall on the Dvina River. He was at least rumored to have been nearby when this occurred.
Well, history also, I think, tells us that rules of engagement, rules of combat they weren't shaped by the Geneva Convention, of course, because we didn't have that yet. How cruel was this conflict? When someone was captured, or if you were face to face with somebody, were there any rules in the Great War?
Well, I think on the Western Front, between the French, German, and British, I think there were gentlemen's rules.
Really?
I don't think. Oh, I think so. Early in the war, there was a lot of propaganda about German. What's the word? Treachery, or Germans burning cities, looting
the cruelty.
Art museum. Yeah, just shooting peasants. Anybody who did tried, anybody took a pot shot at a German soldier, they killed 40 from the village. You hear these things, you have to give it a grain of salt, because the British had managed to cut the underground cable between Europe and or Germany and America. So the preponderance of these stories were told from the British side, who were trying to whip up support. As far as in Russia, some of that might have existed, but there are tales of atrocity. In particular, Company C. There was a patrol went out on November 29th, 1918. In the Uspodenga region, about 230 miles from Archangel. Deep snow, 60 men walking along, and all of a sudden they were attacked by hundreds of Bolsheviks. And as in a running fight, what happened was there was a group of them that were surrounded, fighting for their lives, and the story was that the Bolsheviks were castrating the men while they were still alive. The story comes through Francis Cuff, a lieutenant with Company C. The legend was that he had shot himself in the head rather than be castrated alive by these men. But that seems to be a real story. Otherwise, as far as prisoners go, there were prisoners taken, maybe between 12 and 20. Ironically, they were treated well. Russia was negotiating at Versailles like all the other nations were, where they were divvying up the world after World War I. And they wanted to be regarded well and come out well and be recognized by all these different countries that the Bolsheviks did. So they really treated American Allied prisoners as well as could be expected, possibly. They patched up their wounds. There were some Americans who finally were taken to Moscow, and they had free run of the place during the day to go out, and there was hardly any food or anything, but if they could find a horse steak or something, they could do that. There was a library. It's kind of funny that in the middle of this war, the prisoners actually were being treated better than the men on the front.
Wow. I would not have expected that, and it's one of those mysteries to me of combat, not ever having been in that situation. It seems like within otherwise mild-mannered men, maybe from a farm background or some normal life background, there can be a switch that flips, and the things that they would do in those situations they would never dream of doing when they were back amongst family and civilization. Just man's treatment of man, I guess, is the way I look
the
at
whole, Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, we are animals. There is within us the capability for evil. We know that very well by now.
Yeah.
And there's also a great capacity for kindness and goodness. But especially in war, the blood gets up. Your buddy next to you has just been killed by the enemy. These kind of things happen, and you just want to even the score. So there's certainly never any place for torture, I believe, or just plain wantonness. But it still does occur. I just simply think human emotions play into that.
Well, and I think there's great benefit for us to learn in today's age of video game combat, remote strategy, where the drones can do a lot of the work that these men did on foot. Right? It's a completely different world. I think it's very instructive for us to understand how hard it was to be in these situations, to be given orders, to be fighting a fight even after the war theoretically had ended, but the telegram hadn't made it out yet and you didn't know, so you're still killing each other. And just what a unique generation it was that not only involved itself in this conflict, but kind of embraced it as a nation, feeding these men as heroes when they returned, knowing that they literally had played a part in defending freedom in a part of the world nobody else is ever even going to visit.
Yeah, I don't think these guys, like I said before, they did know the war was over at a certain point, probably towards late November. Even people were rotating in and out of Archangel, which is certainly in communication with the greater world, and they come back to these units and say, "Hey, do you know the war ended?" And you're just like, "Yeah, okay, pass the ammunition." It was kind of like for these men with that knowledge, and then to be fighting under these conditions, dying in these conditions. 235 of the men of the regiment were killed or from disease in battle, from wounds received. That mentally, I think, would be the toughest thing to take. On the Western Front, the American Army, the American Expeditionary Force, they knew at least that they were fighting for something. They were fighting definitely for whatever you want to call it, for American freedom, for their comrades next to them. But in Russia, the latter is really all they had, was fight for the guy next to you. We don't know why we're here. We just have to endure, and we'll go home when they tell us we can. So until then, we're just going to be stuck here fighting. And that, I think, mentally would be harder than that faced for men on the Western Front, who could see, they knew what victory would look like. In northern Russia, they had no clue, even though the Allied command had no clue, what does victory look like, And like they said in Vietnam, maybe they should have just declared victory and gotten out, which they basically did without declaring victory.
If you're a fan of the positive, inspiring interviews we share each week on The Big Impact, this news will be of great interest because we've overhauled, renovated, remodeled the rewards you'll receive when you support The Big Impact on Patreon. Whether it's $5, $10, $20, or $50 per month, we've got a special something for everyone who joins our team as we continue bringing positive conversations to a culture in need of uplifting content. So, go to patreon.com and search for The Big Impact. Check out the new rewards and do what you can to help the show.
You love stories of inspiration, hope, and encouragement. That's why you're listening to The Big Impact. But do you ever feel as if your marriage is in need of inspiration, hope, and encouragement? Have you fallen into the roommate mindset and maybe given up on truly enjoying life with your spouse? Don't give up. Listen in to the Marriage Talk podcast. Marriage Talk is hosted by Bill Hobson, the same voice you hear every week on The Big Impact. On Marriage Talk, he's joined by a veteran licensed marriage counselor to discuss important issues and questions from listeners and married couples all around the world. There is hope for your marriage. Listen, learn, and put into practice the advice you'll hear on Marriage Talk. Check out the Marriage Talk podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and wherever podcasts are found. You'll also find every episode they've done online at marriagetalk.org.
We are visiting with James Carl Nelson, the author of The Polar Bear Expedition, here on The Big Impact. And in the moments that we have left, James, I'm intrigued by some of the people, the names, the personalities involved in this group of men known as polar bears. As I mentioned at the outset of our conversation, a good number of them came from my home state of Michigan and played heroic roles in how all of this played out. I know that in the early part of the book, in the prologue, there's Lieutenant Harry Meade. What's his story, and what are some of the other names that jump out at us as we look at this unique time in history?
Harry Meade grew up in Valparaiso, Indiana, as a family ran a boarding house. And, in fact, Lowell Thomas, the famous self-promoter, journalist, globetrotter, Lawrence of Arabia promoter, actually stayed there, and Harry got to know him. And it was funny because when the 339th was stationed outside of London before going to Russia, Harry ran into Lowell Thomas, who's just returned from Saudi Arabia, and they started chatting, and Harry says, well, we're just about to leave for France, and Lowell Thomas tells him, that's not what I hear, you're going to Russia. So that's how pretty much the regiment found out that they were on their way to Russia. And he went to school at the University of Michigan and went to law school and was a practicing attorney in Detroit when he volunteered for officers training at Fort Sheridan, Illinois. It's a similar story with a lot of the officers. There's another interesting character, Harry Costello, who had been a great football hero at, of all places, Georgetown University. It was a football power back then.
Wow.
And they called him 9-Point Harry because he single-handedly seemed to defeat the University of Virginia, their arch rival, every year, and scored all 9 points in one game. He was a real character, real Irishman from Connecticut, tough guy. There was Joel Moore, who had been a football coach and an athletic trainer, high school teacher. He was a little bit older. He was about in his mid-30s when he volunteered for officers training. He was in charge of Company M through the war. And Harry Costello came home and wrote a book, a very bitter book called Why Did We Go to Russia? And Joel Moore and Harry Mead and another fellow also came home and wrote a book, basically a little more mild. It wasn't a diatribe, but it was a long account, the history of the American expedition fighting the Bolsheviki, which was a great resource. Covered a lot of different areas, and in first-person fashion. Harry Mead was able to tell the story of what happened in Nizhny Gora in January of 1919. John Cudahy, another lieutenant, he was from suburban Wisconsin, suburban Milwaukee. There's actually a suburb called Cudahy there, scion of a wealthy family, and when he arrived at Company B headquarters in the fall of October of 1918 on the Vina River, he ingratiated himself right away by bringing all sorts of treats for the men, and smokes and food and these kind of things. And there's another soldier, a PFC Donald Carey, who was from Michigan, rural Michigan, farmer son, and he fought with Company E through the war and just spent the rest of his life documenting, like day by day, what went on, the fighting that went on, the day-to-day interactions, and he became a school principal later in his life before returning to farming. So it was a mix. As usual, the lieutenants were well-educated. The rest of the men were, there was plenty of immigrants from inner Detroit. There were farm boys. There were small-town kids. They're typical mix for a doughboy regiment at the time, I would say.
Do they stay brothers for life when they return?
Yeah, they formed the Polar Bear Association and held reunions and just, didn't want their story to go away, to die. And in fact, they also wanted to honor the dead. And in 1929, a contingent of these men got permission to go back into Russia. And they searched through the battle areas where they'd been, these small villages, and were able to recover 86 bodies, disinterred them, and sent them back to Michigan. Some bodies were claimed on the way from different states. And in 1930, they had commissioned a polar bear monument, a big statue of a polar bear. It's actually quite beautiful. And in Whitehaven Cemetery, Whitechapel Cemetery in Troy, Michigan. And some of the bodies were buried around there. There's like 56 bodies buried around this polar bear that seems to be guarding them almost. I was there in September. It was quite a moving place.
It's amazing. And you've written so much about the Great War. I'm wondering what it is about that event that motivated you to do such research. You've immersed your life into it. Why?
Well, my grandfather was a doughboy. He was severely wounded at Soissons on July 19th, 1918, left out on the field and bleeding, and was picked up in the morning by some Senegalese stretcher bearers with the French unit. And he lived to be 101. He never really said much about it except that little story about how I was shot. And it just always captivated my imagination. I was always interested in military history, and as I got older and older, he didn't die until 1993 at 101. I just thought, I need to find out what really happened. What was the story? And so that's what became my first book, The Remains of Company D, with a story of his company, the men in it, just would explain what he went through their words, where he was unable to do that. He was a Swedish immigrant, not a writer, not much of a talker. Then that led to another book, Five Lieutenants from Harvard educated who served in the First Division. That led to my third book, I Will Hold, about a Marine, Clifton Cates, who started out as a junior officer with the Marines and then became Marine Corps Commandant in 1949. And I think it started a thread, my first book. And I just find it fascinating. I think it's overlooked, World War I. I think the sacrifices that these men went through is overlooked. So World War II overshadows World War I so much. Our participation in World War I only lasted really about 6 months of actual combat. Our losses were 53,000 men killed in action or died of wounds compared to millions on some other countries. So, it can be overshadowed, but still all these men were great heroes to go over there, leave their homes. Many of them jumped to enlist in the spring of 1917. And I just find the whole era, the American wonderment, the American spirit, the spunk, that's what I love.
I was just going to ask you about that American spirit. I have no doubt whatsoever that today's enlisted men and women have the same level of commitment and bravery and toughness that is described in the Polar Bear Expedition, but I'm not so sure that the outside of the military culture does. It seems like we're a little soft these days. What did it require for those back home to help these men succeed? There was a national toughness to it, wasn't there?
Well, I believe people were tougher in general. I mean,
yeah.
They grew up with very few of the amenities we have today, and they were just tougher. They worked long hours. They quit school to help their families, help support their families. That's what happened with my grandfather. All my grandparents, in fact, they all came from Sweden. I think life was hard, and men and women became hard. If you look at some of these photos of people from the 1880s or wherever, they look like they've lived hard lives, and they usually have stern expressions on them, and it just wasn't easy, and they died younger than they died today. It was just, I think, a feeling of, or a knowledge of life is hard. Nobody expected it to be easy, and we just have to do what we have to do. There's more, these days, we're all softer. I think, we've all got our electronic appliances and our cell phones and our video games and big screen TVs. And there's not that spirit of, like with Iraq or even Afghanistan. We're not involved as people in that.
Right.
Our military is, what I mean? There's separation these days between what's going on militarily and what's going on socially. There's much bigger, I think, these days than it was in the past.
Well, they didn't spend a lot of time taking selfies back in 1917.
No, or feeling sorry for themselves or whatever. It was they were tough people. I admire them.
Yeah. Well, James, the book is fascinating. It's called The Polar Bear Expedition. It's just hot off the presses. You can get it right now. If you're listening to this as a podcast, we'll put the link to the book in the notes to the podcast. If you're listening on the radio, you can go to Amazon or anywhere else and get it. It's The Polar Bear Expedition by James Carl Nelson, and we're so proud to have a great representation of heroes from the Midwest represented in this group. Certainly there were others, but we'll focus on our local boys, if that's okay with everybody.
That's okay.
Yeah. And James, thanks for all the work you've done to bring back the importance of that era, because we often lose track of it. So well done, my friend.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this insightful, encouraging, and uplifting edition of the Big Impact Podcast. We would love to hear your thoughts, so reach out to us through the website at bigimpactpodcast.com or on our Facebook page and on Twitter at Big Impact. We would love to hear from you, not only with your thoughts on this week's episode, but on any other great guest ideas you might have. Somebody that you know is inspiring, encouraging, and uplifting. And don't forget, you can go back and listen to every episode of the Big Impact we've ever done for free on our website, bigimpactpodcast.com. Thank you for joining us. I'm Bill Hobson, and we'll talk to you again next week with another edition of the Big Impact Podcast.